We all pay rent or mortgage every month, and we often know exactly what that cost is. But how much are we spending just to get where we need to go? For a lot of Americans, transportation is the hidden cost of where we live, and it's a cost that's baked into the way we've built our cities. Now, in this part two, we're taking it to the streets. This episode, Yonah Freemark of the Urban Institute stays with us, and we're bringing in Sam Sklar, the writer and consultant behind Exasperated Infrastructure, to talk about the other half of the equation, transportation. Because the way we move through our cities isn't separate from where and how we build, it is the land use. And with March Madness in full swing, we put Yonah and Sam head to head on the transit investments they think are reshaping American cities. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. Now that we have Sam with us, I'm very excited. I kind of want to make this bridge that we often talk about the housing burden of costs being 30% of household income. And it doesn't really take into account the transportation cost of living. In places where it might be cheaper to live, the transportation cost is sort of unseen in that 30% of household income and that sort of layer there. There's such a strong interconnection between land use and transportation. And Yonah and Sam, both of you work a lot in terms of mobility and what it means to invest in transit and walkable places. And I just want to get your thoughts. And maybe we can start with Yonah, how should we think about transportation infrastructure as shaping where and how cities grow?
Urban development has always been a factor of what transportation options are available. So, the city that existed before motorization was entirely a city of walking, right? So that's why cities that were developed pre-railroad, pre-car were very small and highly concentrated. As we've developed new modes of transportation, we have simply extended the range, the number of miles that we're able to travel for any specific need. And this has resulted in changes in urban development style. And I think over the second half of the 20th century and now in the 21st century, I think we've come to acknowledge that just following what transportation allows you to do is not necessarily the better outcome. And that's why we end up with, new policies that attempt to circumscribe that in some way.
Sam, I think this speaks directly to your blog and platform, Exasperated Infrastructure. It feels like it is exasperated as a user and it is exasperated as an infrastructure form. Can you expand on that?
It's a really great question. So when you first sounded over these questions, the first thing I thought of when you talked about how transportation and land use are often seen together is that transportation is in fact the land use, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's only so much footprint that we can have as a city and as a suburb. And all the choices that we've made, to Yonah's point, back in the medieval times, the only mode of transportation for most people was on foot. And so you could build narrower roads. There were no such thing necessarily as sidewalks. Everyone was sort of walking from point A to point B. And as urbanization has expanded, as the modes of transportation have gotten more complex, and that allows us to grow both up and out, the idea of a road as a land use has allowed for a total rethink of policy choices, right? Roads, rails, trails, all these policy choices that translate into the built environment. And new transportation infrastructure that doesn't contribute to either access or well-being or dignity or the economy can also be seen as a net loss for the community, because transportation is also seen as a system regionally. So what you see is these perverse economic disincentives. You see a lot of diseconomies of scale as transportation, if it's not necessarily building new rail or new forms of multipliers here, you're seeing a lot of economic disincentives. And that is the story, I think, of the American suburb.
I've planned new cities in areas that are formerly agricultural land or rail yards or dilapidated brownfield sites where the first inkling is what is the percentage of land that's reserved for roads? And it's something crazy, like 30% of land is reserved for the vehicle, where, it doesn't take up 30% of my time to be in a car, but that's how much we've allocated to space. And so, Yonah, I know you have prolific writing and work through the Urban Institute, but you also have your own platform called The Transport Politic, where you analyze transit investments globally and what separates transit projects that truly shape cities and those that don't, and sort of start consolidating this 30% of land into something smaller in terms of how people are able to move more efficiently.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a baseline assumption that the road is the required unit of transportation that must exist in every place and to every doorstep. And that assumption results in this massive use of roadways for everything, right? And you put roadways in front of every single door, and you're required to have that type of access, which results in this massive use of space for highways, roadways, etc. I like to think that we are thinking past that. I think a lot of communities in Europe are in their new developments thinking about approaches to density that do not require there to be a road in front of every building. And that means sort of taking a step back and saying, why is it that we think the road is there? What purposes is it serving? And how can you serve those purposes through other approaches? And I think that means, making sure that the pedestrian infrastructure is really effective, having great cycling infrastructure, making sure the transit connections are there, et cetera.
Sam, in practice, does there need to be a roadway going to every single door? What are people in the city building space thinking about as they're connecting land use and different types of modes?
I think there are different areas of city building and planning and construction and engineering that all have different incentives. So I think a lot of planners and engineers think about the approach to a goal maybe similarly in a lot of ways. What their goal is might be different. So when an engineer at a Department of Transportation, whether that be at the local, state, or more regional level, is thinking about access to opportunity, they're thinking about what scope they've been handed to build because this is what it's always been done. And so to your point, do they want to build a road to every land use? So they want to go right up to the front door? I think that depends on how our leaders are interpreting scopes of work at this point. So that starts really at the political level. That starts at the leadership level of, or are we drawing up scopes that are reflecting the needs of the community going forward? And I've seen in my practice this shift over the last 10 years. A lot of engineers are thinking a lot more clearly about maybe challenging a scope with their team and with other folks involved in the room. So you've got safety folks, you've got folks outside the organization. Advocacy plays a really big role in this, but there's a lot of goodwill to be bought from the community by reaching out and building a coalition around what's actually needed from a scope. What I've seen change also is the general where the spend is going in a lot of ways, right? We're still seeing. So one of the big disconnects here is that we see a lot of this federal spending still go to highway capacity expansions with some maintenance and some repaving, but there's always some level of highway capacity at the federal level, so the interstates. And as you shrink down state DOTs, some are getting much better at others at thinking about how they want to spend their dollar to have the most impact. And so I'll call out specifically Virginia DOT here. I'll call out, I think, historically Hawaii DOT, Washington State DOT, and maybe ironically Tennessee DOT. These are all DOTs that are thinking a little bit differently about what the purpose of a dollar to be spent is. And specifically for Virginia is the Smart Scale program that started, I think, around 2012. The current secretary, this guy named Nick Doherty, who was, I think, maybe the assistant secretary at that time, and he was able to convince the legislature to think about spend a little bit differently, to be more practical with every dollar that comes in and goes out to meet the needs of the local community. So it's really a bottom-up, top-down sort of middle-out process in a lot of ways.
I've been seeing a lot of these clickbait articles about, what happens if BART, the regional transit agency in the Bay Area near San Francisco, what if that was to shut down? Ridership has been declining and fare box revenues have just not been where they were pre-COVID. And there are conversations happening to shut down parts of this legacy transit system. And that seems to be reverse of what you're saying, Sam, is like, it's not this bottom up, top down approach of like where dollars are most well invested. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives, is this just clickbait for its sake, or what are the conversations around transit systems that are not performing to their pre-COVID levels now that we are, 5 years past that point in time?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some conditions that have changed dramatically in the United States since COVID that are hard to get past, right? If most people who are formally taking transit have the option to work from home, then people are not going to take transit as much, definitionally. The reality is that in the United States, over the past, few decades, transit has increasingly come to serve a narrowing portion of the job force. And that narrowing portion is focused around downtown office jobs and the services that accompany those. That's what the transit systems in most cities are designed to serve. And when you have a situation where a huge share of those particular workers, and those workers specifically, are the ones who are allowed to work from home or encouraged to work from home, then of course transit systems are going to be suffering the consequences of that. My perspective is that I don't think we're at a lost hope situation at all. I think there's a lot of examples of cities that have invested in projects and in service that's all day, that is frequent, that is reliable, and they are bringing back riders at higher rates than they had before COVID. It's obviously not the majority of transit systems, but it does suggest that there's a way to go forward. And it just means changing our approach to transit away from the one that was in place in the pre-COVID world.
Yonah, I could not agree more. To answer your question, Kate, if parts of BART shut down indefinitely, that would be a total disaster for the Bay Area in a lot of ways, because to expand on Yonah's point, people use transit for other things besides work. And historically, what we've measured outside of a handful of travel surveys is commute to work. And that's what the census measures. Some MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, the regional organizations responsible for regional planning, do more discerning surveys. But I think it requires, to Yonah's point, also a rethink of what transit is for, and that it's not a public service necessarily, it's a public good. And it doesn't lose money, it costs money. These are investments worthwhile in creating opportunities, in building community, in allowing folks to have dignified access to wherever they're going without having to pay the admission fee of owning a car, let's say, to society. That is one use of transit. And this is where a lot of incredible advocates have stepped up their game. And most cities and places where there's transit, we see in New York, where I live, our current mayor ran on this idea. And I don't know if we want to open this can of worms of fast, free, affordable buses in New York, and whether that's a good idea or not, but it was one of our new mayor's pillars that he ran on transit because it's so important to getting around New York. Places like the Bay Area in Southern California, you see the new metro measures to expand. I think it's the K line, both north and south in Los Angeles. You see movement from groups in Ohio to expand rail access for folks in Ohio, constant moving in Chicago and in DC. They're always thinking about what to do next. And I don't think transit is dead at all, but if we let it die, it will. So we need to just continue to think about telling great stories about what transit does for people.
Well, one way to not let it die is to focus on transit-oriented investment and build up places outside of central business districts where land use and these transit hubs really converge. And, you and I were talking about how Washington and California have recently passed these transit-oriented development incentive policies to really focus not just on a way to save transit, but on a way to bring more housing supply and more livability to these areas that are already amenity rich, and how the state has invested in its mobility infrastructure. Have we seen that incentivizing transit-oriented development has actually saved or kept these transit systems on life support in other parts of the world and other parts of the country?
I don't think transit systems are going to be saved by transit-oriented development, at least anytime soon, right? I mean, the reality is that transit in the US requires a subsidy to survive because of a combination of high implied subsidies that we provide to car use through cheap prices of gasoline, free parking, etc., and the reality that our transit systems just cost a lot of money to operate. And so that can be made up to a very small degree by revenues produced by transit-oriented development, but it's a small element in the overall story.
It's a tool in the toolbox. It helps to tell a story. It makes logical sense that where you've got a density of buses and trains and other forms of non-single occupancy vehicle car-oriented travel, that you would want to cluster housing around that. You are matching the point A with point B relatively logically. I'll give an example. You're talking about Washington State. Linwood is a suburb just north of Seattle. And in response to the extension of the One Link light rail to downtown Linwood, because land use is local. And so where Sound Transit is more regional, land use is local. The city of Linwood lifted its density restrictions in around the downtown. So what does that say? It says zoning is both something that's legible for folks, and removing these restrictions is a way to signal to the development community that Linwood is open for business. It's accessible to jobs in the Puget Sound region with this new regional access. But the other side of this coin is that just because you've upzoned, or just because you've allowed for more transit-oriented development, incentives and density bonuses that make a lot of projects pencil that otherwise wouldn't, that's not necessarily translated into immediate development right away. There are other factors to consider, specifically on the lending side. So if you think about how banks think about risk and underwriting loans, this is new for them. There's not a lot of examples of underwriting without maybe minimum parking requirements or density bonuses that there are no comparables anywhere in the region if you're not going with a national bank. And so this is going to take some time to socialize, but having the ability to focus on performance rather than exclusion, I think allows for a new story to be told about what we expect from our transit, what we expect transit to do for as many people as possible within a TOD radius of quarter mile, half mile, depending on where you are.
You're going to take this in a slightly different direction. We're in the midst of March Madness right now. If you had to think through what your bracket looks like in terms of transit or mobility projects that you would want to go up against each other, and if we could just pick one or maybe two that you'd like to share, and we can go head to head. I just want to get a sense of like what is really piquing your interest right now. And so, Sam, you want to go first?
I do, because I think Yonah's going to have a lot to say on this. You spend so much of your time focusing on these projects. Can I do three? Is that okay?
Sure, let's do it.
So the first one is the Queens Link project that's going to connect northern and southern Queens with its first rail connection since the 1960s. This is a project that the right-of-way already exists. It's owned by the city of New York, and the rail already is laid. So the question is, it's just about manicuring the site, rebuilding some of the structural improvements, and then you're able to give direct access from folks in Rockaways down where the beaches are and all that to Manhattan on a one-seat ride in 40 minutes, something that does not exist right now. Ton of economic benefits there. They just released a business case documenting the economics and the safety benefits and the congestion benefits. The second one is the Roosevelt Boulevard subway in Philadelphia. This one has gotten a lot of thoughts. A friend of mine, and maybe of yours too, Yonah, is Jay Arzu, who's a advocate in Philadelphia. He's getting his PhD from the planning school at Penn, and he's been advocating for this sort of relatively obvious project that connects North Philadelphia, the center city, that's not relying on Roosevelt Boulevard, which is a very wide car-oriented corridor right now. I'd love to see that project move forward against some of the alternatives, or at least to continue to exploration. And the third one is not a project I think on anybody's radar, except maybe folks in Chicago, is Western Avenue. Western Avenue is the longest continuous street in Chicago. It runs north to south, and it's got pretty sparse transit right now. There are some buses that serve it, but to me, it's 24 miles long, and it's ripe for BRT. This is a tenth of the cost of a light rail. There's plenty of room for a gold platinum standard BRT with half-mile spacing, off-board fare collection, articulated buses, center through running, which would create this incredible spine, I think, for folks who live maybe 20 minutes or so walk from the Brown Line up in Lincoln Square, for example. So these are three, and I could go on and on and on, but I'll pass off to Yonah here. Curious your thoughts.
When I used to work in Chicago, there was the plan for a bus rapid transit line on Ashland Avenue, which is parallel to Western Avenue. And that project felt like it was going to be transformative because it was going to be high investment quality, center running bus lanes, frequent buses. And the mayor just killed it. Rahm Emanuel. The city had spent years planning for it, and it was a really good project. It would have had tons of riders, and it served, relatively dense corridor, and the mayor just didn't like it and didn't like the business opposition to it. And I'm sort of stung by that project, honestly. It's painful to think about because it's too common that we have projects that make a lot of sense and that would be valuable additions to our community, and that a few powerful people are able to sort of stand in the way and say, well, we don't like it. It will be too annoying for our drivers. And, it makes the transformation of our cities into better places much more challenging. So all that said, I think there are plenty of, exciting projects out there, certainly that I'm thinking about. Just to name a few, there's a project in Los Angeles that is sort of a subway line that will parallel the 405 expressway from the Valley into Westwood, where UCLA is. And what's cool about this project is that it's paralleling arguably like the most congested highway in the nation. And it's a highway that they've tried repeatedly to expand and gotten, it has, of course, no benefit in terms of reducing congestion. But what this subway is going to make possible is just radically altering people's connection between two areas of the city that aren't that far from one another, but in terms of time, often feel extremely disconnected. So I'm really excited about seeing that project move forward. I'm also excited about the Interborough Express in New York City, which is a new light rail line that is being planned to connect Brooklyn and Queens. And it's an interesting project because it's being built on an existing freight railroad corridor, which might save a little money, but this being New York, things are going to be extremely expensive. That is just reality, I guess, in New York City right now. Nonetheless, it's going to be an amazing project because what it does is connect a bunch of subway lines and provides a sort of circumferential connection across neighborhoods in the city, and will allow people to not have to go through Manhattan to make transfers between different parts of the city. And, in some ways that's actually similar to the Valley to UCLA line in LA. And it's sort of what we're thinking might be valuable for transit lines in general, right? We don't have to have all transit lines going through downtown to provide a real benefit to our communities.
That's awesome. I mean, we're sort of coming up on time. I want to leave you all some minutes to riff off each other. I just want your thoughts on if you could redesign cities and approach their growth in like a different way. So we've seen dense cities that didn't have the automobile at that point in time. And then we've seen the introduction of the car and how that's changed cities. What does a new version of city building look like?
Think about what it would look like to build neighborhoods without car dependence at every corner, right? It means being willing to accept streets that really only have to have allowances for fire trucks occasionally. Worst case, streets where actually most of the street is dedicated to landscaping rather than to pavement. That's the kind of sort of different type of development that we need to start seeing as more common, and even retrofit some of our neighborhoods into, if we want to get people a different type of lifestyle in our cities.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the smartness of cities, right? The autonomy and AI playing a role. And a friend wrote a book several years ago. Maybe you've read it, called The Smart Enough City. This is Ben Green. He's a professor. He wrote this book called The Smart Enough City. It's sort of thinking about technology as what do we need to include in the development going forward to make sure that people have dignified and safe access to where they're going, while also making people's lives a little bit better, right? I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying that autonomy is blanket a bad thing. What I don't want to see is going way, way, way too far too quickly and connect everything via sensors and think about every city policy, thinking about how do we make this city easier for cars to move around, right? Because what autonomy will do is it will trade curb space for cruising. Our car is still a car. It's still a geometric being that takes up space in our cities. And so it gives us a real opportunity to think about what we want as we transition from more, I would say, more human operated to more software operated vehicles. I just want to lead from a place of positivity here. Let's center the pedestrian. Let's center the human. Let's make sure that every policy is thoughtful and how does this benefit someone moving through the city, sort of agnostic of their mode. Let's make transit the number one choice. Someone's going to drive that should be electric and eventually should be autonomous. And one thing that's a bedrock to my practice as a writer, as a consultant, as an advocate is safety and dignity of pedestrians. How do we make sure grandma can get to the supermarket without having to wait for 4 buses at a bus stop that doesn't exist, on sidewalk and pavement that isn't level. Maybe the supermarket or the store or the doctor isn't so far away from her. There's not an opportunity for her to live in a community where she can get to where she goes, how she chooses. And so I think about this all the time. Dignity is one of these things that I'll harp on, and it's changed my business.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.